Well, as you can probably see, the purpose of our study here this morning is to relate the work of Elijah to the Valley of Dry Bones. And we're going to spend the whole session on Ezekiel 37 and hopefully make the most of the opportunity to unravel this wonderful chapter in the prophetic scriptures, amongst, of course, the prophecies of restoration of Ezekiel. Now, Brother Thomas wrote in Opus Israel, there is then a partial and primary restoration of Jews before the manifestation, which is to serve as the nucleus or basis of future operations in the restoration of the rest of the tribes after he has appeared in the kingdom. The pre-adventual colonisation of Palestine will be on purely political principles, and the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the messiahship of Jesus and of the truth as it is in him. They will emigrate thither as agriculturalists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth, but more immediately of getting rich in silver and gold by commerce with India and in cattle and goods by their industry at home under the efficient protection of the British power. And when he wrote that, of course, there were virtually no Jews in the land of Palestine. And today, of course, there are 6 million Jews in the land. In fulfilment, as we saw of Joel 3 verse 1, behold, in those days and at that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah, Jews in the land, 1948, and of Jerusalem, the events of 1967. So we see them there. But brothers and sisters, we need to be careful. When we come to Ezekiel chapter 37, it's not actually about that. That's part of it, okay? It's not actually about that fact. And we're going to see this morning as we proceed. Now, there were 5 Aliyahs up to the Second World War. Aliyah, of course, simply means a going up, an ascending up. There were 5 waves from 1882 or thereabouts right through to the period of the Second World War, when, of course, access to the land was prevented. Of course, what God did was marvellous, wasn't it? He had sent them fishers. He sent Theodore Herzl, First Zionist Congress in 1897. He was followed by Chaim Weizmann, the Jew who lived in Manchester and invented synthetic cordite and saved the British from humiliation at the hands of the Germans in the First World War, for which he was given as a reward, he and his community were given as a reward the Balfour Declaration of the 2nd of November 1917. And then the British got the Protectorate of Palestine in 1921 under the League of Nations. And of course, the rest's history, isn't it? But you see, they didn't respond to the fishers that God sent. The Jews of Europe wanted to be integrated. They were comfortable in Europe. They didn't want to leave. So he had to raise up hunters. Jeremiah 16 and verse 16. And after will I send many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain, from every hill, from the holes of the rocks. And so the final solution was introduced under Hitler. And the man that you can see behind Hitler there in the lower right-hand corner is Reinhard Heydrich, who really was the founder of the awful final solution. He was given orders by Hitler under Himmler to go away and find a solution to this problem. You know what they'd been doing in Russia? Well, they're going around shooting Jews. There's an unfortunate situation of a woman just being shot, a Jew, a child in her hands, all right? They were shooting Jews, so they were putting them in the backs of trucks and gassing them. But that wasn't efficient enough. You couldn't kill enough Jews that way. So they then invented the gas chambers. The gas chambers and the ovens of Treblinka and Majdanek and Sobibor, those awful places, okay? Yahweh sent them hunters. They were not responding, so what's he going to do? He wants that nation re-established. There's got to be a partial and primary restoration of the Jews. That's an essential part of prophecy. And so it happened. After World War II, when the gates were open, finally, after much tribulation, through the British blocking access to the land, literally hundreds of thousands of surviving Jews in Europe and from elsewhere returned to the land. And of course, the rest is history. We had the vote on the 29th of November 1947 to petition the land. And then only 6 months later, on the 14th of May 1948, we have the declaration of the State of Israel. As David Ben-Gurion stands up in the museum in Tel Aviv and makes that declaration. And then we have, of course, the War of Independence, 48, 49. And in 49, under the tutelage of Australia, yes, under the tutelage of Australia, Israel was made part of the United Nations. Remarkable events, brothers and sisters, all of which are part of what happens here in Ezekiel 37, but it's not the essence, as we're going to see, of Ezekiel 37. So what's in this chapter? Well, verses 1 to 10 are about the resurrection in the valley of dry bones. Verses 11 to 14, we have the revival of the whole house of Israel referred to. Verses 15 to 17, the two sticks are joined into one. In verses 18 and 19, Ezekiel's sign is given to the children of Israel of the joining of these two sticks. And then in verses 20 to 28, we have the explanation of all of that. The division of David's kingdom back in the days of Rehoboam is reversed. After 3,000 years, it's reversed. And the nation is back together, one nation with one king being king to them all. He's described here as David. That's appropriate, isn't it? Because it's obviously a reference to Christ, the beloved. But he is described as David. So it's a wonderful prophecy, this Ezekiel 37. But there's things you need to grasp hold of to interpret it correctly. So you've got this valley of dry bones, the subject of the first 14 verses. Then we read this in verse 9. It says this. As you get towards the end of verse 9, because we'll come back to this a little later, it says, "Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, come from the four winds." Now that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Come from the four winds. What does that remind you of? Well, it sounds a bit like Zechariah 2 verse 6 to me, which we saw as a very important passage in relation to Matthew 24 verse 31. "Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." Now, the word I want out of that, of course, is that word slain. What you can see there on the right hand of this of the screen here is one of many thousands of huge pits that were dug to bury literally millions of Jews. By the time that most of them were thrown into those pits, they were simply skin and bone. They died, obviously, of starvation or disease, or they were useless for work, so the Germans just put a bullet through the back of their head, and they were thrown into these pits. That is their history. And you can go back further, of course, to the pogroms of Russia and of Europe. You can go back further to the Spanish Inquisition and the slaughter of millions of Jews. Their history has been one of being slain. Terrible, isn't it? Absolutely terrible. Brought upon them, obviously, because of their waywardness and their ungodliness. Yeah, the divine judgments have fallen in a very bitter way upon them. Now, there are certain vital keys to the interpretation of Ezekiel 37, and we need to nail these down at the very outset. The first of those keys is in verse 11. Now, I suggested to the young people, and the bulk of them did this, they got out a highlighting pen and pencil, and they actually highlighted certain phrases in this chapter. And if you don't do it now, I would suggest you have a look at it later and do this, because every time you read this chapter, you've got certain things highlighted. It's going to stand out at you, and you're going to have the keys. There are keys here. And here's one of them. Verse 11, it says this. "Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones," and this is the phrase that you would highlight, "these bones are the whole house of Israel." It's key. So the bones don't just represent the Jews in the land or the Jews outside the land. They represent the whole Jewish race. They are the whole house of Israel. Okay? The whole race. Jews in the land, the return of Christ, Jews outside the land, the return of Christ. They're all involved in that phrase. Then you come to verse 6, and this is even perhaps even more critical. Because it says in verse 6, "And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and ye shall live." So we've got these bones, and the bones are ultimately brought together, as we're going to see. But, skeletons are no good to anybody, are they? You know, there's a few skeletons in cupboards here and there, but they're no good to anybody, are they? You've got to have sinew and flesh and living substance on the bones. But even that's no good to you, is it? I mean, if the angels had put Adam together and made him into a body of flesh and bone, but hadn't breathed into him the breath of life, well then, kaput, he's gone. It's no good to you. You've got to have breath of life breathed into this body. So we read in that verse, I'll put breath in you and ye shall live. Now what does this mean, brothers and sisters? What does it mean to live here? He's not talking about natural life, is he? He's talking about spiritual life. So what we learn from verse 6 is very important. That when the flesh is put on the bones and the breath of life is breathed into these bodies, that is the time when they will know Yahweh. This is about spiritual life. When that nation as a whole knows Yahweh, as it says at the end of verse 6, that's when they have life in the body. Now this phrase that ends verse 6, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh, occurs again at verse 13. In verse 13 you read, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh. Now when is this going to happen? Well, read on. When I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves, and shall put my spirit in you, and ye shall live, and I shall place you in your own land. See, it can't happen until they're all back into their own land. It'll be the people of the Jews that Elijah brings back that have come into the bonds of the covenant, that know Yahweh, that will enter the land. That's the time. But he goes on to say this in verse 14, I shall place you in your own land, then shall ye know that I, Yahweh, have spoken it and performed it, saith Yahweh. So we learn something very important from verse 6 and verses 13 through 14. We learn that this life that is given to these bones, when the flesh is put on them and the breath of life is breathed into them, this has to do with a spiritual state of mind. It's when they are at one with their God mentally and morally. They know Yahweh as you and I should know Yahweh today. So that is a key element. There's another one, and it's in verse 7. And verse 7 says this, So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise. Now this is in the Hebrew, it's a loud noise. It's a noise that you can't miss. There was a noise, but there was more than a noise. There was a shaking. Behold, a shaking. And the bones came together, bone to his bone. So what brings the bones back together? This is before the flesh is put on them, all right? What brings the bones back together is a very loud noise and a violent shaking. Well, what could that be? Well, it can only be the great political earthquake, which begins with a literal earthquake, doesn't it? Remember how in Matthew 24 we read about the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, which was Armageddon? That's a pretty loud noise, isn't it? It's a very loud noise. And what it does, according to Revelation 16 verse 18, which is a very handy verse to have alongside of Ezekiel 37 and verse 7, it talks about the beginning, the pouring out of the seventh vial of the wrath of God, which does begin with a literal earthquake, the earthquake of Zechariah 14 and verse 5. But it goes on for 40 years. And what it is, this is the third great earthquake of the apocalypse. It's that period of 40 years in which the second Exodus is going to occur. That's the period being spoken of here. The loud noise and the great political earthquake that will see the redemption of all Israel. You might want to just note the fact, you can see on the screen there a reference to Jeremiah 30 and verse 7. If you read that passage, it talks about this is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Yeah, goes right back. And we might have a chance to have a look at that in a subsequent study. I'm sure we are going to look at that a little later on. So here we have the vital keys to interpret Ezekiel chapter 37. There's a real drama here, isn't there? And just summarising what we have in verses 7 to 10. Let's just read this, brothers and sisters. I want you to see the connection between verse 6 and verse 9. How about we read again verse 6? I will lay sinews upon you, and I will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, put breath in you, and ye shall live, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh. So, says the prophet, I prophesied as I was commanded. Notice that? That's what John was saying, wasn't it? Do these prophets speak from their own mind? No. I prophesied as I was commanded, he says. And as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and bone came together, bone to his bone. And when I beheld, lo, another thing happened, and sinews, and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Then said he unto me, prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, Son of Man, and say to the wind, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. Now I'm going to leave Ezekiel 37 just once in this session today, and it's now. So put something in Ezekiel 37 and come back to Jeremiah chapter 3. And the reason I've got to do this is because I was deficient yesterday. I didn't actually get to Jeremiah 3 and verse 15. You know, it's quite common for me to sort of spend all this time preparing and then miss the punchline. You know, so I don't tell jokes very well at all. You know, I can't remember the punchline. But we read in Jeremiah 3, we read in verse 14, turn, O backsliding children, saith Yahweh, for I am married unto you. And I will take you one of a city and two of a family, and I will bring you to Zion. You might recall we sort of went off onto a tangent talking about what that really means. But then I forgot to read verse 15, and it says this, and I will give unto you pastors. Now that word pastors, I mean, it has a sort of an unpleasant connotation for us, doesn't it? We think about church pastors and so on. The word actually means to feed sheep. It's got the idea of feeding sheep, tending sheep. So I'm going to send you shepherds and teachers according to mine heart, which shall feed you with knowledge and understanding. And the word feed there, by the way, is the same word as pastors in the Hebrew. So you've got the idea of feeding sheep. This is the flock of God. So I wonder who these shepherds and teachers are. Oh, well, you guessed it in one. It's you. Yeah, it's you and me. Because if we are there in that day, you're not going to sit around doing nothing. You're going to spend your whole time teaching people. I mean, they don't listen much today, do they? You can't get people to listen much today. But in that day, they're all going to listen. And they're going to need teachers. One-on-one teachers, by the way, not just in big crowds like this. One-on-one teachers. It's the very best way of teaching, by the way. All right? Sit down and you can have this interaction between teacher and scholar. What do you mean by that? And you'd explain it and lay it out before them and take it as slow as you need to take it. Right? That's what you're going to be doing, brothers and sisters. You're the pastors and the teachers. And that's what's referred to here in Ezekiel 37. Because when you read here that in verse 9, this breath that comes from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain that they may live, look what happens. Verse 10, so I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Yeah, that's what the Jews returning under Elijah, and indeed even the Jews in the land that Christ purifies, are going to be. They're going to be an army. It says in Zechariah 14 verse 14, and Judah in that day, this is post-Armageddon, shall fight at Jerusalem. In other words, they're sent forth from Jerusalem to do some fighting on behalf of Christ. And we know, of course, that the Jews coming back with Elijah are going to be a great army. The battle axe of Yahweh, the horse of his warfare, as we'll see in our subsequent studies, God willing. An exceeding great army. And why are they impelled to do this? Well, because you see, they're new people. They're beginning to become new people. Life has been given back. Now they know Yahweh. And as they fight their way back through that 40 years, they're fighting their way back under the tutelage of Elijah and the saints, their pastors, their teachers, who will be teaching them these things. That's the great message we read here in Ezekiel 37 of our work to come, brothers and sisters. What a wonderful thing that will be. Now Armageddon, of course, as we saw in Matthew 24:30, is called the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. It is the beginning of the process of putting these bones back together. The laying of sinew, the breath, etc., refers to the work of Christ in the land and of Elijah outside the land in turning ungodliness away from Jacob. And you and I hope to be personally involved in that. So just a reminder, we've just made reference to this in the previous slide. There are these two distinct stages of work. And this is what Ezekiel 37 is about. As you're going to see in a moment, this is what Ezekiel 37 is about. It's about these two stages of the work. There's the work of our Lord Jesus Christ, who saves the tents of Judah first, immediately after Armageddon. And then there's the work of Elijah, leading the second Exodus for 40 years to recover all the Jews, along with many of the saints who will go forth. So Christ is going to have saints in the land with him, doing this work with him. Elijah's going to have saints with him, doing that work outside the land. And it'll all really start, even though Elijah's work begins 3.5 years before Armageddon, in terms of a warning and a message, it doesn't and it cannot get underway until the dramatic events of Armageddon. That's when the Jews will be willing. You know, in Psalm 110 and at verse 3, Brother Thomas uses this phrase in relation to the Jews. In actual fact, I believe the context is about the saints, but it can be applied to the Jews. You know what he says? In the day of thy power, thy people shall be willing. Yeah, and it's only when that power is manifested in the earth that the Jews are going to have a willingness to follow Elijah. Won't be until then. So let's just come back now and focus on this little bracket of verses in Ezekiel 37, verses 15 through 19, because this is where these two stages are referred to. Remember the formula? You're going to get sick of me putting this up, aren't you? Remember the formula? Israel, Ephraim. Did you notice there's something new about this slide? I put Joseph up here. That wasn't there before. Okay, so why have I put Joseph up there? Well, because you're going to read the name Joseph in two places here. You're going to read it in verse 16 and in verse 19 of Ezekiel 37. And you're going to read it in harmony with the name Ephraim. Okay? So we know that these titles, Israel, Ephraim, and the remnant of Jacob, refer to the Jews outside the land at the time of Armageddon. Judah refers to the Jews inside the land. And this rule applies where it's the people who are the subject and not the land itself. So we have two sticks that are going to be united. Let's read from verse 15. And the word of Yahweh came again unto me, saying, Moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick. Let's stop there. This word stick is etz. E-T-S. Now, it's the common word for stick or wood in the Old Testament, but it has some very significant uses. Do you recall the passage in Deuteronomy that says, Cursed is he that hangeth upon a tree? Yeah, the word is etz. All right, so when we think about this, it's interesting, isn't it? Why does God choose a stick? Why not something more, sort of fashionable than that? A stick. Two sticks. Well, because you see, the whole point of this exercise is to get these people into Christ. And there's only one way to get into Christ, isn't there? That's by sharing his death and resurrection through baptism. There's only one way. And so we're going to see, as we go through this, we're going to see that the work in the land and the work outside the land is designed to achieve that final objective. And these two sticks are ultimately brought into one stick. Right. An amazing thing, brothers and sisters. So we read of Judah here, verse 16. It says, Moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick and write upon it for Judah and for all the children of Israel, his companions. Now hang on. Why does it make that statement? We understand what Judah represents, that's the Jews in the land at the return of Christ. But what about this other statement? The children of Israel, his companions. Well, you see, if you use the term Judah of old in the days of, say, Rehoboam, when the kingdom was split, who are you referring to? Well, Judah and Benjamin, the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. But as history went on, you know what happened? Because Jeroboam in the north corrupted the way of God, the Levites left and came south. And as time went on, you come down to the times of Hezekiah. Remember the times of Hezekiah when he sent the message? A lot of them laughed them to scorn, but some of them actually upped stakes. I mean, this is a big thing. This is like people moving from Queensland to New South Wales. You just don't do that, you know. Sorry about that. Yeah. But, you know, they had an inheritance. I mean, if you're a Queenslander, we're very parochial in Queensland, you know. You have an inheritance. You don't leave it. This is a big thing to pick up stakes and move from the north down to the south. Huge, because you leave behind your inheritance. Where are you going to live? But they did it. They did it because they couldn't find the truth in the north. Now, you can find the truth in the north today, but anyway, they couldn't find the truth in the north. So they came down to Judah. So what did Judah end up being? It had 12 tribes plus the Levites in it. It had a mixture, didn't it? Yeah, exactly. So if you go to the land of Israel today that God calls the people in it Judah, what do you find? Well, if you went back, and only God knows the origins of these Jews, he knows what tribe they originally came from. Guess what you're going to find? All 12 tribes and Levites. Yeah, they're a mixture. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what tribe they're from. If they happen to be in the land at the time of Armageddon, they're called Judah. Got it? Right, well, let's move on, because the next phrase says this. And take another stick, he says, and write upon it for Joseph the stick of Ephraim, and for all of the house of Israel his companions. Now notice what it says. It doesn't say that the stick's called Joseph, does it? It says, for Joseph the stick of Ephraim. So the stick's actually called Ephraim. So you've got one stick Judah and one stick Ephraim. But then you've got this other phrase, it says, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. So if Ephraim refers to the Jews who are outside the land, and you go out today, as Elijah and the saints will, and you chase down the origins of the Jews who are outside the land, guess what you're going to find? All 12 tribes and Levites. All right? So there you are, brothers and sisters, you see. It doesn't matter what tribe they come from. That's irrelevant to God. If they happen to be in the land, they're Judah. If they happen to be outside the land, they're Israel or Ephraim or the remnant of Jacob. Simple as that. So that's why that formula is just so important. So we come to verse 17. This is about the restoration to the land. He says, and join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in thine hand. So this is the objective. Now, how's this going to come about? Well, we've got this little section from verses 18 onwards. Verse 18, and when the children of thy people shall speak unto thee, saying, what on earth are you talking about? Wilt thou not show us what thou meanest by these? Say unto them, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his fellows, and will put them with him, even with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in thine hand. Now when you read that, what is it telling you? Well, if you read it carefully, it's telling you, when he says with the stick of Judah, it means he's taking another stick, the stick of Ephraim, from another place and putting it with Judah, who just happens to be in the land at that time. Got it? Clearly Judah is already in the land at the time. And then we read on. Verse 20, and the sticks whereon thou writest shall be in thine hand before their eyes, and say unto them, thus saith Adonai Yahweh, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, or nations, whither they be gone, and will gather them on every side and bring them into their own land. You know, I used to sit in lectures, public lectures once, many, many years ago, 2 or 3, 4 decades ago, and up would come these old slides, you know, that would go up, whatever they were, what I used to call those things, overhead projectors, and before that, lanterns. Have you ever seen lantern slides? You know, it's ancient history now, but anyway, I'd be sitting there as a younger person, and up would come the slide on Ezekiel 37, verse 21 onwards, and across it would be this big stamp, fulfilled. Well, I just accepted it. But it's not right. It is not right. It's not fulfilled, brothers and sisters. And it can't be fulfilled until two sticks are one. All right? Which means we're getting towards the end of the 40 years of the judgment period beyond Armageddon. We've got to be at the end of the second Exodus, which will end about 3.5 years before the temple is opened for service. That's when it will be fulfilled. So verse 21, he says, I'll bring them into their own land. Now, how do we know that's true? Well, just read the next verse. What does it say? And I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel. So you've got one stick, you've got one nation. So if Judah's in the land and Ephraim's outside it, they can't be one until Elijah has brought the Jews back into the land, purified, brought into the bonds of the covenant. And then it says this, and one king shall be king unto them all, and they shall be no more two nations, neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms any more at all. So let's just step back, bring them into their own land. Yes, there had to be a partial restoration of the Jews to the land. And beginning in the 19th century, a steady stream of Jews began to return to the land until the nation was formed in 48. But the final fulfilment will require the completion of the second Exodus. So here's our timeline, brothers and sisters. The bottom of that slide, here's our timeline. You have the 1800s and the 4 Aliyahs, and then the 5th just before the Second World War, when Jews came back. You know how many Jews there were in the land of Israel at the time of the declaration of the State of Israel? Anybody got any idea?
600,000.
Approximately that. Somewhere in that range. About 500,000. There are 6 million Jews today in the land. Very small number came back. But then we had this wonderful period of the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948. Okay? Very important milestone in the divine program. The return of Christ is still in front of us, brothers and sisters. And 10 years beyond that, we'll have Armageddon, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Just prior to that, prior to Armageddon, Elijah begins his work. He doesn't receive much response, but Armageddon gets a response. And he completes that second Exodus over 40 years. So when do we get the one stick? At the end of the second Exodus. All right? That's when the two sticks are brought together. And we have one nation upon the mountains of Israel, and one king is king to them all. That's a wonderful thing, isn't it? We can look forward with great anticipation to this. Brothers and sisters, we've got a land here divided up into 13 sections. Just like there are 13 tribes, if I might say. You've got 12 plus the Levites, see? It's got 13 sections. And one of the great things about this is the divine design. If I was doing this, a reasonably technical mind, I would have 6 tribes above the Holy Oblation and the Prince's Portion, and 6 tribes below. What about you? Not God. You don't do it that way. He has 7 tribes, beginning with Judah, going from Judah to Dan, 7 tribes above the Holy Oblation, and 5 below. Now, why would you do that? Well, 7 happens to be the Abrahamic covenant number, and 5 happens to be the number of divine grace. Nobody gets into this land unless they receive divine grace through being in Abraham. Nobody. The Jews that come back under Elijah had to be brought into the bonds of the covenant. They're not getting in here. until they are in the bonds of the covenant. And that's the principle that God sets out in this land. And when they do come back, they don't have a choice. There's no choice. If you belong to Dan, you better like fishing, because your border is the Euphrates. All right? And if you don't like water, then you're probably not going to enjoy being down here with Gad, because you're going to be on both sides. You're going to have water. And you have a port there where people will come to worship in the temple. Jews will not be able to choose where they go in this land, but your unbaptised children and grandchildren, should at least one of their parents go into the kingdom, can actually choose wherever they like among those 12 tribes. And that's the subject matter of Ezekiel 47, verses 21 to 23. Many of you will have heard me talk about that in the past. It's one of the things I think is perhaps in many ways the most wonderful expression of divine grace in the entire Word of God, that 2,600 years ago God knew that there would be faithful Christadelphians in the earth when his Son was sent from his right hand. And that those faithful Christadelphians, many of them would have children, young children, far too young to be at the judgment seat to be judged, far too young to be held responsible, or in that mid-teenage period where they're sort of jumping around but largely behaving themselves. He knew that, brothers and sisters, and made provision that they would have an inheritance amongst his people, the Jews, in these tribal cantons, with this privilege that the Jews don't have, that they can actually choose what tribe they're going to be in. Think about that. What a God we serve. I haven't got time to take you to Ezekiel 47. I'd love to do that, but I'm watching the time. But you know, many of you know this to be the case. I thank God for that, brothers and sisters. Almost every day the provision has been made for our children. And that's why we should be praying as hard as we can that God might work in the lives of our children and grandchildren. That they don't get snapped up by this evil world with all of the gadgetry and the evils that come through that gadgetry. And I know too much about that. We should be praying that God will work in their lives, that when Christ does come, they'll be found at least partly behaving themselves, and at least prepared to live in the family home, not held responsible perhaps, but that's up to God and Christ. But if they're in that state, this is what awaits them. And they're going to be there, brothers and sisters, to see the returning Jews under Elijah. We'll come to the valley of Achor and we'll come up and meet the Lord Jesus Christ in the almost completed temple. And there's going to be that scene we mentioned the other day, like Joseph who met his brethren. A great outpouring of emotion and tears, the redemption of this people. All nations will ultimately be under him, and he will have dominion from sea to sea. This is the subject of the end of Ezekiel 37, isn't it? Verse 22, we read, I will make them one nation, the land upon the mountains of Israel. This is the final result, attained just a few years before all nations submit to Christ and the temple is open for worship. And one king shall be king to them all. This 3,000-year-long division is now over. And he says in verse 23, neither shall they defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions, but I will save them out of all of their dwelling places wherein they have sinned, and will cleanse them. So shall they be my people, and I will be their God. Now, we should focus for a moment on that final section of verse 23. You know where that comes from? Does anybody know where that comes from? Read the screen and I'll tell you. It comes from Genesis chapter 17, verses 7 and 8. I think we got time. Just keep a hand in Ezekiel 37 and I'll break my promise and go outside it again. Genesis chapter 17. This is where God changes the name of Abram to Abraham, from exalted lofty father, to the father of a multitude of nations. And then we got this promise in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 17. As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, Abraham, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. Verse 8, and I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. You see, when you read this phrase that you read here in Ezekiel 37 and verse 23, so they shall be my people and I will be their God, and you will find it frequently in the prophets. You'll find it in Jeremiah, you'll find it throughout Ezekiel. Whenever you read that, brothers and sisters, it's talking about the fulfilment of the covenant made to Abraham. And the great thing about that is that applies to us today. He is our God, and we are his people because we're in Christ. And that's the destiny of all of the Jews, both in the land and outside the land. And you're going to achieve it under the tutelage of Elijah and of Christ in the land. You're going to be involved in that as pastors and teachers. Everything you do today to grow in understanding is going to be useful to you. Don't think you're going to get to the judgment seat and go to the right hand and some sort of disc is going to be thrust into your back and all of a sudden, you know everything. It's not going to happen. Yeah, you'll improve, no doubt about that. You'll have the ability to recall things. You know, one of the great things about the earnest of the Spirit that was given to the apostles was that they could recall later on what the Lord had taught. All the books in the world couldn't contain it, but they could remember. Yeah, wouldn't that be terrific if you've come to Bible school after Bible school, being as we are, you forget things, that when you become immortal, you better recall everything that was said from the platform that was of any value. Wouldn't that be terrific? But you're not all of a sudden going to know everything. Anything you can do today to prepare to be a teacher, a shepherd in the future is going to help you. And you know, you do tend to pick people who are prepared for a job, don't you? Yeah, the ones who have shown that they're ready, you do tend to pick them. And we need to think about that. So this is the wonderful prospect before us. And David's mentioned in verse 24, and David my servant shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. And they shall walk in my judgments and observe my statutes to do them. Now David, of course, we know means the beloved, clearly a type of Christ. My servant, it's a title of Christ. Who is he? Well, he's a prince in verse 25. They shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt. And they shall dwell therein, even they and their children and their children's children, successive generations, forever, or at least for the Olam, for the hidden period, for the 1,000 years. And my servant David shall be prince forever. Just like Gabriel said to his mother in Luke chapter 1. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob for the age, and of his kingdom, that is, territorially, of his kingdom, there shall be no end. And if you want proof that what I just said is correct, have a look at Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. Christ's kingdom does have an end, doesn't it? Time-wise, it has an end. But Christ's kingdom will have no end in terms of territory. He will rule the whole world, and the nucleus of that will be the kingdom of Israel restored in the midst of the earth. So what we have in verse 26 is the promise of peace to come. Moreover, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will place them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore. Yes, it's a covenant of peace in a covenant land. This word peace, of course, shalom, has the idea of unity, peace through unity. They will be one with their God. And this will go on for 1,000 years through the Olam period, the hidden period, the millennium. And there will be the sanctuary, brothers and sisters, in the midst of them, as verse 26 and again verse 28 points out. Heathen shall know that I, Yahweh, do sanctify Israel, when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them forevermore. So why will that be the case? Why will God be happy for that to be the case? Well, because there's life in them. And that's what verse 27 says. My tabernacle also shall be with them, yea, I will be their God, and they shall be my people. My covenant to Abraham will be fulfilled in them. There's life in them. They know Yahweh. Just, brothers and sisters, we should know Yahweh now.